Joseph Smith is increasingly coming under fire for his claim of translating the Book of Abraham along with its facsimiles. Egyptologists and other erudite naysayers have repeatedly stated that Joseph Smith's explanations and translations of the facsimiles are wholly erroneous. Nothing Joseph translated matches the translations of the experts. Yet, who is to say that the experts, with all their scholarly degrees, understand the texts themselves? Egyptologists themselves admit they do not understand the rudiments of Egyptian religion, the basis of the texts in question. To this day, scholars argue over the number and definition of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, over whether the religion was monotheistic or polytheistic, and over who these gods really were. For example, scholars still debate over the origin and identity of the god Osiris, whom all acknowledge as one of the primary gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and a key figure in the Book of the Dead, as well as in the Book of Abraham facsimiles. The fact is that Egyptologists simply do not know who or what Osiris was. The figure or myth of Osiris is found in all three facsimiles of the Book of Abraham. Facsimile number 1, for example, which Joseph describes as the attempted sacrifice of Abraham by a priest of Elkanah and Pharaoh, is iconographically based upon the mummification of Osiris by the god Anubis. Experts have argued that this is merely a common illustration from Egyptian texts, and has nothing to do with Abraham. Joseph, so the claim goes, has misinterpreted the scene and its characters. Yet, facsimile number 1, while sharing the overall design of the funerary scene, is quite different. The figure on the lion couch is clearly not Osiris, and the figure of the priest is certainly not the jackal-headed Anubis. The objections of the experts miss the point. Abraham, in the first chapter of his book, tells the reader exactly what the facsimile is. Abraham's claim, not Joseph's claim, is that facsimile number 1 is a representation that Abraham himself sketched. While Abraham may have drawn from Egyptian iconography to depict the sacrificial scene, it cannot be considered a direct replica of typical Egyptian funerary illustrations. Identifications of individual characters in facsimile number 1 cannot be made according to the norms of Egyptian funerary texts, since Abraham, not Joseph, has adapted them to fit another narrative. This pattern holds for the other facsimiles as well. Facsimile number 2, correctly identified as a hypocephalus, is especially direct in its insistence that whatever the Egyptian norms are for hypocephali and their interpretation, they do not apply to this facsimile. Joseph's explanation of the facsimile repeatedly uses the word represents. As in facsimile number 1, we have a representation and not a faithful or literal copy of an ordinary Egyptian hypocephalus. Furthermore, Joseph uses the word signify to explain what certain figures mean. This can only mean that the text is a form of symbolic encryption. Figure number 3 is especially important in understanding what Joseph, or more accurately, what Abraham is doing with this facsimile. Figure 3 is the figure of Ra on his so-called solar boat. Joseph's explanation, on the other hand, says that it is a representation of God on his throne. But the key here is that Joseph says that the figure has been intentionally changed. It has been made to represent God. Again, Abraham has adapted a pre-existing formula to meet his needs. In this case, Ra is being symbolically used to typify God. Not that the figure is not Ra, it is just that the figure must now be identified as God according to Abraham's symbolic adaptation. Each of the figures of the facsimile are symbolic representations and must be treated as such. Adhering to conventional interpretations mischaracterizes the claims of the facsimile itself. Facsimile number 3 follows the same pattern as the first two. Abraham has adapted a common scene from the Book of the Dead to tell an entirely different story. Joseph's explanation is symbolic. For example, the crown upon the seated figure's head represents the priesthood and is emblematic of the grand presidency in heaven. Figure 3 signifies Abraham in Egypt, again indicating a symbolic interpretation. It is not uncommon for artists to use known figures to represent others, according to the artist's intent and what he or she wanted to communicate. For example, Raphael used likenesses of contemporary artists to represent the great Greek philosophers in his famous fresco, The School of Athens. The two central figures of the fresco are universally understood to be Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. The figure of Plato can be easily recognized as a likeness of Leonardo da Vinci. That is, Raphael painted Leonardo and then symbolically identified him or represented him as the Greek philosopher Plato. For the figure of Aristotle, Raphael painted Giuliano da Sangallo, an Italian sculptor, architect, and military engineer of the time. Now, no art expert would accuse Raphael of fraud for claiming that the figure on the left represents Plato when they all know that it is, in reality, a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. It is an artistic convention that is well established. Note this self-portrait by Albrecht Durer, who iconographically represents himself as Jesus Christ. Why then do Egyptologists accuse Joseph Smith of fraud when he, or rather Abraham, uses stock Egyptian characters to represent others in an alternative storyline? Joseph never claimed that the figures in the facsimiles were not Osiris, Hathor, Anubis, Horus, and so forth. He merely claimed that they represented Abraham and events in his life in Egypt. Joseph repeatedly states that the figures are representations and adaptations. Quibbling over identities misses the point entirely. The problem with the controversy over the Book of Abraham is not that Joseph Smith failed to understand basic Egyptian hieroglyphs. It is that Egyptian experts failed to understand Joseph's simple, straightforward English.